Greetings, anarchists. Let's see if I even remember how to make this thing stream. I'm kidding. Oh, man. We're going to have some good reading tonight. We are, I say we, I don't know why I say we. I have destroyed and I'm in the process of recreating my studio and broadcasting setup here, so it's only half back. This is kind of a shakedown test. Got a couple more things to change, so we'll see how it goes. But we've taken a break from a lot of the content on this channel for the past couple weeks. And one of the things that I missed doing was reading. So that's what I'm going to do. We're going to read. We're going to continue our reading of the Anarchist Handbook by Michael Malice. We're going to pick up where we left off with Lysander Spooner with book or part 18. We're getting really close to the best parts of Lysander Spooner. I'm so excited. For those that are new here or that haven't done a Let's Read with me before, think of this like a Let's Play, you know, where you go and you watch somebody else play a video game and you get their commentary. That's what this is. This is not like an audiobook performance that I've done where it's supposed to be professional and it's not any of my commentary or opinions. It's not even the book club videos that I do where we read other people's articles and works with no commentary. The point of this is to get my thoughts and commentary as we go. If that's not what you're looking for, go pay Malice for his actual audiobook that he read. You'll get it with no commentary. It's just the audiobook. That's not what this is supposed to be. So I don't know. I think I've said that every time I've started one of these, but I still get people in the comments upset that I'm pausing to comment. It's like, that's the point, guys. Come on now. All right, let me get some coffee and we'll get started. Okay. Good to see you, Alexander. We're streaming to Facebook today. That's weird. We're also on Float and everywhere else, except we're not on Odysee today. Takes too long to get that set up. All right, here we go. Lysander Spooner, No Treason, part 18. The Constitution, having never been signed by anybody, and there being no other open, written, or authentic contract between any parties whatever, by virtue of which the United States government so called is maintained, and it being well known that none but male persons of 21 years of age and upwards are allowed any voice in the government, and it being also well known that a large number of these adult persons seldom or never vote at all, and that all those who do vote do so secretly by secret ballot, and in a way to prevent their individual votes being known, either to the world or even to each other, and consequently, in a way to make no one openly responsible for the acts of their agents or representatives, all these things being known, the questions arise. Who compose the real governing power in the country? Who are the men, the responsible men, who rob us of our property, restrain us of our liberty, subject us to their arbitrary dominion, and devastate our homes and shoot us down by the hundreds of thousands if we resist? How shall we find these men? How shall we know them from others? How shall we defend ourselves and our property against them? Who of our neighbors are members of this secret band of robbers and murderers? How can we know which are their houses that we may burn or demolish them? Which their property that we may destroy it? Which their persons that we may kill them and rid the world and ourselves of such tyrants and monsters? These are questions that must be answered before men can be free, before they can protect themselves against this secret band of robbers and murderers who now plunder, enslave, and destroy them. The answer to these questions is that only those who have the will and the power to shoot down their fellow men are the real rulers in this, as in all other so-called civilized countries. For by no others will civilized men be robbed or enslaved. Among savages, mere physical strength on the part of one man may enable him to rob, enslave, or kill another man. Among barbarians, mere physical strength on the part of a body of men, disciplined and acting in concert, though with very little money or other wealth, may, under some circumstances, enable them to rob, enslave, or kill another body of men as numerous, or perhaps even more numerous, than themselves. And among both savages and barbarians, mere want may sometimes compel one man to sell himself as a slave to another. But with so-called civilized peoples, among whom knowledge, wealth, and the means of acting in concert have become diffused, and who have invented such weapons and other means of defense as to render mere physical strength of less importance, and by whom soldiers in any requisite number and other instrumentalities of war in any requisite amount can always be had for money, the question of war, and consequently the question of power, is little else than a mere question of money. As a necessary consequence, those who stand ready to furnish this money are the real rulers. It is so in Europe, and it is so in this country. In Europe, the nominal rulers, the emperors and kings and parliaments, are anything but the real rulers of their respective countries. They are little or nothing else than mere tools, employed by the wealthy to rob, enslave, and, if need be, murder those who have less wealth or none at all. The Rothschilds, and that class of money-lenders of whom they are the representatives and agents, men who never think of lending a shilling to their next-door neighbors for purposes of honest industry, unless upon the most ample security and at the highest rate of interest, stand ready at all times to lend money in unlimited amounts to those robbers and murderers who call themselves governments, to be expended in shooting down those who do not submit quietly to being robbed and enslaved. They lend their money in this manner, knowing that it is to be expended in murdering their fellow men, for simply seeking their liberty and their rights, knowing also that neither the interest nor the principal will ever be paid, except as it will be extorted under terror of the repetition of such murders as those for which the money lent is to be expended. These money-lenders, the Rothschilds, for example, say to themselves, if we lend 100 million sterling to the Queen and Parliament of England, it will enable them to murder 20, 50, or 100,000 people in England, Ireland, or India. And the terror inspired by such wholesale murder will enable them to keep the whole people of those countries in subjection for 20 or perhaps 50 years to come, to control all their trade and industry, and to extort from them large amounts of money under the name of taxes. And from the wealth thus extorted from them, they, the Queen and Parliament, can afford to pay us a higher rate of interest for our money than we can get in any other way. Or, if we lend this sum to the Emperor of Austria, it will enable him to murder so many of his people as to strike terror into the rest, and thus enable him to keep them in subjection, and extort money from them for 20 or 50 years to come. And they say the same in regard to the Emperor of Russia, the King of Prussia, the Emperor of France, or any other ruler, so-called, who in their judgment will be able, by murdering a reasonable portion of his people, to keep the rest in subjection, and extort money from them for a long time to come, to pay the interest and principal of the money lent him. And why are these men so ready to lend money for murdering their fellow men? Solely for this reason, viz., that such loans are considered better investments than loans for purposes of honest industry. They pay higher rates of interest, and it is less trouble to look after them. This is the whole matter. The question of making these loans is, with these lenders, a mere question of pecuniary profit. When I was doing the actual audiobook, I tried that word like 10 times, and then I had to go stop and leave the audio booth and go look up the word and check its pronunciation and practice it. And then this time I just got it first try. Man, that's crazy. A mere question of pecuniary profit. They lend money to be expended in robbing, enslaving, and murdering their fellow men, solely because, on the whole, such loans pay better than any others. They are no respecters of persons, no superstitious fools, that reverence that reverence monarchs. They care no more for a king or an emperor than they do for a beggar, except as he is a better customer and can pay them better interest for their money. If they doubt his ability to make his murders successful for maintaining his power, and thus extorting money from his people in future, they dismiss him as unceremoniously as they would dismiss any other hopeless bankrupt, who should want to borrow money to save himself from open insolvency. When these great lenders of blood money, like the Rothschilds, have loaned vast sums in this way for purposes of murder to an emperor or a king, they sell out the bonds taken by them in small amounts to anybody and everybody who are disposed to buy them at satisfactory prices to hold as investments. They, the Rothschilds, thus soon get back their money with great profits, and are now ready to lend money in the same way again to any other robber and murderer, called an emperor or a king, who they think is likely to be successful in his robberies and murders, and able to pay a good price for the money necessary to carry them on. This business of lending blood money is one of the most thoroughly sordid, cold-blooded, and criminal that was ever carried on to any considerable extent amongst human beings. It is like lending money to slave traders, or to common robbers and pirates, to be repaid out of their plunder. And the men who loan money to governments, so-called, for the purpose of enabling the latter to rob, enslave, and murder their people, are among the greatest villains that the world has ever seen, and they as much deserve to be hunted and killed, if they cannot otherwise be got rid of, as any slave traders, robbers, or pirates that ever lived. This is the Anarchist Handbook. This is the Lysander Spooner section. Good to see you guys. Welcome in. We're having an evening of reading good stuff. When these emperors and kings, so-called, have obtained their loans, they proceed to hire and train immense numbers of professional murderers, called soldiers, and employ them in shooting down all who resist their demands for money. In fact, most of them keep large bodies of these murderers constantly in their service, as their only means of enforcing their extortions. They are now, I think, 4 or 5 million of these professional murderers constantly employed by the so-called sovereigns of Europe. The enslaved people are, of course, forced to support and pay all these murderers, as well as to submit to all the other extortions which these murderers are employed to enforce. It is only in this way that most of the so-called governments of Europe are maintained. These so-called governments are in reality only great bands of robbers and murderers, organized, disciplined, and constantly on the alert. And the so-called sovereigns in these different governments are simply the heads or chiefs of different bands of robbers and murderers. And these heads or chiefs are dependent upon the lenders of blood money for the means to carry on their robberies and murders. They could not sustain themselves a moment but for the loans made to them by these blood money loanmongers. And their first care is to maintain their credit with them, for they know their end is come the instant their credit with them fails. Consequently, the first proceeds of their extortions are scrupulously applied to the payment of the interest on their loans. In addition to paying the interest on their bonds, they perhaps grant to the holders of them great monopolies in banking, like the banks of England, of France, and of Vienna, with the agreement that these banks shall furnish money whenever, in sudden emergencies, it may be necessary to shoot down more of their people. Perhaps also, by means of tariffs on competing imports, they give great monopolies to certain branches of industry, in which these lenders of blood money are engaged. They also, by unequal taxation, exempt wholly or partially the property of these loanmongers, and throw corresponding burdens upon those who are too poor and weak to resist. Thus, it is evident that all these men who call themselves by the high-sounding names of emperors, kings, sovereigns, monarchs, most Christian majesties, most Catholic majesties, high mightinesses, most serene and potent princes, and the like, and who claim to rule, quote, by the grace of God, by, quote, divine right, that is, by special authority from heaven, are intrinsically not only the merest miscreants and wretches engaged solely in plundering, enslaving, and murdering their fellow men, but that they are also the merest hangers-on, the servile, obsequious, fawning dependents and tools of these blood-money loan-mongers, on whom they rely for the means to carry on their crimes. These loan-mongers, like the Rothschilds, laugh in their sleeves and say to themselves, these despicable creatures who call themselves emperors and kings and majesties and most serene and potent princes, who profess to wear crowns and sit on thrones, who deck themselves with ribbons and feathers and jewels, and surround themselves with hired flatterers and lick-spittles, and whom we suffer to strut around and palm themselves off upon fools and slaves as sovereigns and lawgivers specially appointed by Almighty God, and to hold themselves out as the sole fountains of honors and dignities and wealth and power. All these miscreants and impostors know that we make them and use them, that in us they live, move, and have their being, that we require them as the price of their positions to take upon themselves all the labor, all the danger, and all the odium of all the crimes they commit for our profit, and that we will unmake them, strip them of their gewgaws, and send them out into the world as beggars, or give them over to the vengeance of the people they have enslaved the moment they refuse to commit any crime we require of them, or to pay over to us such share of the proceeds of their robberies as we see fit to demand. Man, what a great book. Look, I had a lot more commentary on the previous books, but Spooner's just good, man. I don't have much to say. All right. What are we at? 19 now. Now, what is true in Europe is substantially true in this country. The difference is the immaterial one, that in this country there is no visible permanent head or chief of these robbers and murderers, who call themselves, quote, the government. That is to say, there is no one man who calls himself the state, or even emperor, king, or sovereign. No one who claims that he and his children rule, quote, by the grace of God, by, quote, divine right, or by special appointment from heaven. There are only certain men who call themselves presidents, senators, and representatives, and claim to be the authorized agents for the time being, or for certain short periods, of, quote, the people of the United States. But who can show no credentials, or powers of attorney, or any other open authentic evidence that they are so, and who notoriously are not so, but are really only the agents of a secret band of robbers and murderers whom they themselves do not know, and have no means of knowing individually, but who they trust will openly or secretly, when the crisis comes, sustain them in all their usurpations and crimes. What is important to be noticed is that these so-called presidents, senators, and representatives, these pretended agents of all, quote, the people of the United States, the moment their exactions meet with any formidable resistance from any portion of, quote, the people, themselves are obliged, like their co-robbers and murderers in Europe, to fly at once to the lenders of blood money for the means to sustain their power. And they borrow their money on the same principle and for the same purpose, viz., to be expended in shooting down all those, quote, people of the United States, their own constituents and principals, as they profess to call them, who resist the robberies and enslavement which these borrowers of the money are practicing upon them. And they expect to repay the loans, if at all, only from the proceeds of the future robberies, which they anticipate it will be easy for them and their successors to perpetuate through a long series of years, upon their pretended principles, if they can but shoot down now some hundreds of thousands of them, and thus strike terror into the rest. Perhaps the facts were never made more evident in any country on the globe than in our own, that these soulless blood-money loan-mongers are the real rulers, that they rule from the most sordid and mercenary motives, that the ostensible government, the presidents, senators, and representatives so called, are merely their tools, and that no ideas of or regard for justice or liberty had anything to do in inducing them to lend their money for the war. In proof of all this, look at the following facts. Nearly 100 years ago, we professed to have got rid of all that religious superstition inculcated by a servile and corrupt priesthood in Europe, that rulers so-called derived their authority directly from heaven, and that it was consequently a religious duty on the part of the people to obey them. We professed long ago to have learned that governments could rightfully exist only by the free will and on the voluntary support of those who might choose to sustain them. We all professed to have known long ago that the only legitimate objects of government were the maintenance of liberty and justice equally for all. All this we had professed for nearly 100 years, and we professed to look with pity and contempt upon those ignorant, superstitious, and enslaved peoples of Europe, who were so easily kept in subjection by the frauds and force of priests and kings. Notwithstanding all this, that we had learned and known and professed for nearly a century, these lenders of blood money had, for a long series of years previous to the war, been the willing accomplices of the slaveholders in perverting the government from the purposes of liberty and justice to the greatest of crimes. They had been such accomplices for a purely pecuniary consideration, to wit, a control of the markets in the South. In other words, the privilege of holding the slaveholders themselves in industrial and commercial subjection to the manufacturers and merchants of the North, who afterwards furnished the money for the war. And these northern merchants and manufacturers, these lenders of blood money, were willing to continue to be the accomplices of the slaveholders in the future, for the same pecuniary consideration. But the slaveholders, either doubting the fidelity of their northern allies or feeling themselves strong enough to keep their slaves in subjection without northern assistance, would no longer pay the price which these northern men demanded. And it was to enforce this price in the future, that is, to monopolize the southern markets, to maintain their industrial and commercial control over the South, that these northern manufacturers and merchants lent some of the profits of their former monopolies for the war in order to secure to themselves the same or greater monopolies in the future. These, and not any love of liberty or justice, were the motives on which the money for the war was lent by the North. In short, the North said to the slaveholders, "If you will not pay us our price, give us control of your markets, for our assistance against your slaves, we will secure the same price, keep control of your markets, by helping your slaves against you and using them as our tools for maintaining dominion over you. For the control of your markets we will have, whether the tools we use for that purpose be black or white, and be the cost in blood and money what it may." On this principle and from this motive, and not from any love of liberty or justice, the money was lent in enormous amounts, and at enormous rates of interest. And it was only by means of these loans that the objects of the war were accomplished. And now these lenders of blood money demand their pay, and the government so-called becomes their tool, their servile, slavish, villainous tool, to extort it from the labor of the enslaved people, both of the North and the South. It is to be extorted by every form of direct and indirect and unequal taxation. Not only the nominal debt and interest, enormous as the latter was, are to be paid in full, but these holders of the debt are to be paid still further, and perhaps doubly, triply, or quadruply paid, by such tariffs on imports as will enable our home manufacturers to realize enormous prices for their commodities. Also by such monopolies in banking as will enable them to keep control of and thus enslave and plunder the industry and trade of the great body of the northern people themselves. In short, the industrial and commercial slavery of the great body of the people, North and South, black and white, is the price which these lenders of blood money demand and insist upon, and are determined to secure in return for the money lent for the war. This program, having been fully arranged and systematized, They put their sword into the hands of the chief murderer of the war, and charge him to carry their scheme into effect. And now he, speaking as their organ, says, quote, "Let us have peace." The meaning of this is, submit quietly to all the robbery and slavery we have arranged for you, and you can have, quote, peace. But in case you resist, the same lenders of blood money who furnished the means to subdue the South will furnish the means again to subdue you. These are the terms on which alone this government, or, with few exceptions, any other, ever gives, quote, peace to its people. The whole affair on the part of those who furnished the money has been and now is a deliberate scheme of robbery and murder, not merely to monopolize the markets of the South, but also to monopolize the currency, and thus control the industry and trade, and thus plunder and enslave the laborers of both North and South. And Congress and the President are today the merest tools for these purposes. They are obliged to be, for they know that their own power as rulers so-called is at an end the moment their credit with the blood money loan mongers fails. They are like a bankrupt in the hands of an extortioner. They dare not say nay to any demand made upon them, and to hide at once, if possible, both their servility and their crimes, they attempt to divert public attention by crying out that they have, quote, abolished slavery, that they have, quote, saved the country, that they have, quote, preserved our glorious Union, and that in now paying the, quote, national debt, as they call it, as if the people themselves, all of them who are to be taxed for its payment, had really and voluntarily joined in contracting it. They are simply, quote, maintaining the national honor. By, quote, maintaining the national honor, they mean simply that they themselves, open robbers and murderers, assume to be the nation, and will keep faith with those who lend them the money necessary to enable them to crush the great body of the people under their feet, and will faithfully appropriate from the proceeds of their future robberies and murderers enough to pay all their loans, principal, and interest. The pretense that the, quote, abolition of slavery was either a motive or a justification for the war is a fraud of the same character with that of, quote, maintaining the national honor. Who but such usurpers, robbers, and murderers as they say ever established slavery? Or what government, except one resting upon the sword like the one we now have, was ever capable of maintaining slavery? And why did these men abolish slavery? Not from any love of liberty in general, not as an act of justice to the black man himself, but only, quote, as a war measure, and because they wanted his assistance and that of his friends in carrying on the war they had undertaken for maintaining and intensifying that political, commercial, and industrial slavery to which they have subjected the great body of the people, both white and black. And yet these impostors now cry out that they have abolished the chattel slavery of the black man, although that was not the motive of the war, as if they thought they could thereby conceal, atone for, or justify that other slavery which they were fighting to perpetuate, and to render more rigorous and inexorable than it ever was before. There was no difference of principle, but only of degree, between the slavery they boast they have abolished and the slavery they were fighting to preserve. For all restraints upon men's natural liberty, not necessary for the simple maintenance of justice, are of the nature of slavery, and differ from each other only in degree. If their object had really been to abolish slavery, or maintain liberty or justice generally, they had only to say, all, whether white or black, who want the protection of this government shall have it, and all who do not want it will be left in peace, so long as they leave us in peace. Had they said this, slavery would necessarily have been abolished at once. The war would have been saved, and 1,000 times nobler union than we have ever had would have been the result. It would have been a voluntary union of free men, such a union as will one day exist among all men, the world over, if the several nations so-called shall ever get rid of the usurpers, robbers, and murderers called governments that now plunder, enslave, and destroy them. Still another of the frauds of these men is that they are now establishing, and that the war was designed to establish, quote, a government of consent. The only idea they have ever manifested as to what is a government of consent is this, that it is one to which everybody must consent or be shot. This idea was the dominant one on which the war was carried on, and it is the dominant one now that we have got what is called peace. Their pretenses that they have, quote, saved the country and, quote, preserved our glorious union are frauds like all the rest of their pretenses. By them they mean simply that they have subjugated and maintained their power over an unwilling people. This they call saving the country. As if an enslaved and subjugated people, or as if any people kept in subjection by the sword, as it is intended that all of us shall be hereafter, could be said to have any country. This, too, they call, quote, preserving our glorious union. As if there could be said to be any union, glorious or inglorious, that was not voluntary. Or as if there could be said to be any union between masters and slaves, between those who conquer and those who are subjugated. All these cries of having, quote, abolished slavery, of having saved the country, of having preserved the Union, of establishing a government of consent, and of maintaining the national honor, are all gross, shameless, transparent cheats. So transparent that they ought to deceive no one. When uttered as justifications for the war, or for the government that has succeeded the war, or for now compelling the people to pay the cost of the war, or for compelling anybody to support a government that he does not want. The lesson taught by all these facts is this. As long as mankind continue to pay national debts, so-called, that is, so long as they are such dupes and cowards as to pay for being cheated, plundered, enslaved, and murdered, so long there will be enough to lend the money for these purposes. And with that money, a plenty of tools called soldiers can be hired to keep them in subjection. But when they refuse any longer to pay for being thus cheated, plundered, enslaved, and murdered, they will cease to have cheats and usurpers and robbers and murderers and blood money loan mongers for masters. And I think Malice might have skipped part of the book, but we have gone all the way to the appendix now. So just for those that have never read this before, I performed this as an actual audiobook without commentary and with much higher production quality than this. And it's available on this channel for free. You can search for it. It's just search Disenthrall for Lysander Spooner, No Treason, the Constitution of No Authority, and you can get the whole book. So we're going to skip to the appendix. This is the most powerful paragraph I may have ever read. So here we go. Appendix. Inasmuch as the Constitution was never signed nor agreed to by anybody as a contract, and therefore never bound anybody, and is now binding upon nobody, and is, moreover, such an one as no people can ever hereafter be expected to consent to, except as they may be forced to do so at the point of the bayonet, it is perhaps of no importance what its true legal meaning as a contract is. Nevertheless, the writer thinks it proper to say that, in his opinion, the Constitution is no such instrument as it has generally been assumed to be, but that by false interpretations and naked usurpations, the government has been made in practice a very widely, almost wholly, different thing from what the Constitution itself purports to authorize. He has heretofore written much and could write much more to prove that such is the truth. But whatever the Constitution really be, one thing or another, this much is certain, that it has either authorized such a government as we have had, or has been powerless to prevent it. In either case, it is unfit to exist. Mm. All right. That was chapter 8. Whew. Let's see. What's next? Chapter 9. Johann Most. From The Science of Revolutionary Warfare, a little handbook of instruction in the use and preparation of nitroglycerin, dynamite, gun cotton, fulminating mercury, bombs, fuses, poisons, etc., etc., written in 1883. So this is an intro paragraph by Malice. German-born anarchist Johann Most was the primary proponent of achieving a free anarchist society through violent revolution. The term anarchist is largely synonymous with terrorist in the United Kingdom, and it is due to Most that this came to be. He popularized the concept and term of, quote, the propaganda of the deed, meaning using assassination or bombs as a means of as a means of advancing one's political position. Almost a century before the publication of Explosives Manual, the Anarchist Cookbook, the translation of Most's The Science of Revolutionary Warfare became an enormous free speech concern. His work was nothing less than a clear manual for the everyday revolutionary on how to build dynamite and other explosives. Here is the introduction to Most's provocative work. All right. Today, the importance of explosives as an instrument for carrying out revolutions oriented to social justice is obvious. Anyone can see that these materials will be the decisive factor in the next period of world history. It therefore makes sense for revolutionaries in all countries to acquire explosives and to learn the skills needed to use them in real situations. It seems to us that far too much time and money has been wasted on false approaches to this objective. Many people obtained expensive textbooks meant for professional chemists and not for the layman, and were unable to understand them. Some individuals may have learned a little in this way, especially in cases where they were able to consult an expert. Everything learned is worth something, so their time was not entirely wasted. We, along with some other people, went a step further and arranged for popularized versions of technical papers on the production of explosives to be published. However, we found that these also were not well understood. Here and there, people started experimenting on the basis of this material, but the results were usually not very encouraging. The equipment they worked with was expensive and fragile, and easily damaged beyond repair when used by unskilled people. The necessary raw materials, when bought from ordinary retailers, usually turned out to be of inferior quality. Upgrading or purifying these raw materials would once again have called for expensive equipment and economic demands beyond the means of the man in the street. It would have been still more difficult to make the materials, both for financial reasons and due to the lack of expertise. We do know some people who have made something resembling gun cotton. Some have even succeeded after their 5th or 6th mixing rig blew up in making small quantities of nitroglycerin and converting it into dynamite. These fortunate ones were then faced with the fact that all their efforts and sacrifices had resulted in something of theoretical value only since one cannot accomplish much with small quantities, and the method was too expensive anyway. To manufacture large quantities of dynamite, one must have a rather expensive setup. Several rooms are needed, so it cannot be done in a private apartment. In fact, it is necessary to locate the workshop away from any neighbors because dynamite manufacture produces a strong smell that would soon betray the operation. Although people have not given up experimenting, we conclude that the demand for dynamite and other explosives required for revolutionary purposes cannot be met on a do-it-yourself basis, and that it is a much better idea to obtain it ready-made from regular industrial sources. Not an ounce of the dynamite that has actually been used by revolutionaries anywhere in the world was homemade. Imperial, royal, and republican government arsenals have had to do the providing. No matter how well guarded they are, the authorities can never completely prevent the disappearance of some of their stores, generally before the material is actually delivered and locked up in the arsenal. On the other hand, dynamite is used for many purposes. so that it is nonsense to believe that it cannot be obtained from conventional suppliers. Everything can be had for money, and that includes dynamite. Revolutionaries with money will be able to get it, and without money they can neither buy it nor make it. So the slogan is, quote, save your pennies. You may object that nothing can be made out of nothing, and that resources are in the hands of others. This becomes a question of appropriating them. Once we are in an era when things are really happening, it would be stupid to consider amateur dynamite production. Dynamite factories and explosive warehouses can be seized just like anything else. The skilled workers there would work just as well for us as for anyone else if we pay them properly. Summing up, we shall from now on not focus our attention on making dynamite, about which there has been so much talk and so little to be seen, and occupy ourselves with how to obtain large quantities of ready-made dynamite. That is the end of that chapter. Okay. That was interesting. You know what it reminded me of, though? 3D printed guns. Let me catch up on comments. Sorry, guys, I was engrossed in the book. Adam has never signed a contract to be ruled. Exactly. And if you did sign a contract, it wouldn't be a ruler. It would be a contract. A relationship. A consensual relationship. Thomas says, love your reading, world-class narrator. Dude, thank you. High compliments. I appreciate it. A lot of practice. A lot of audiobooks. Okay. Yeah. We're definitely on a list. Yeah. Okay, chapter 10. Louis Ling. From Famous Speeches of Our Martyrs Delivered in Court. When asked if they had anything to say why sentence of death should not be passed upon them, October 7, 8, and 9 in 1886. All right, intro by Malice. This ought to be another interesting one. Here we go. On May 4th, 1886, a still unknown person threw a bomb at a labor demonstration in Chicago's Haymarket Square. In the ensuing chaos, dozens were injured and several killed, including 7 police officers. As a result of this, 8 anarchists were arrested in connection as part of a conspiracy, even though most of them hadn't actually been there at the time. 4 of the men would later be hanged for the events, 2 sentenced to life, and 1 to 15 years. Bombs were found in the 8th man's, Louis Ling's, home, for which his attorney's weak excuse was that Ling had the right to have bombs in his house. Through the ages, this has become popularized as Ling supposedly proclaiming, quote, I couldn't have thrown that bomb, I was at home making bombs. Ling could be regarded as the mythical Che Guevara figure of his day, with his outraged defiance at the court inspiring an entire generation of young revolutionaries. Rather than hanging, Ling smuggled a blasting cap into his prison cell and blew off his jaw, writing, quote, Hooray for Anarchy on the wall in German with his own blood before dying. Okay. All the Haymarket martyrs were posthumously pardoned, and a monument later raised in their honor. Wow. Okay. Now we're reading the actual article by Louis Ling, I guess. Oh no, wait. This is a famous speeches of our martyrs delivered in court when asked if they had anything to say why sentence of death should not be passed on them. So this is Louis Ling. Okay. A wild book all of a sudden. Court of Justice. With the same irony with which you have regarded my efforts to win in this, quote, free land of America, a livelihood such as humankind is worthy to enjoy, do you now, after condemning me to death, concede me the liberty of making a final speech. I accept your concession, but it is only for the purpose of exposing the injustice, the calumnies, oh, new word, calumnies. Calumnies? Oh boy. Gotta look this one up, guys. This is my OC. This is just how I am. Calumnies. Calumnies. A false statement maliciously made to injure another's reputation. Okay. The calumnies and the outrages which have been heaped upon me. You have accused me of murder and convicted me. What proof have you brought that I am guilty? In the first place, you have brought this fellow Seliger to testify against me. Him I have helped to make bombs, and you have further proven that with the assistance of another I took those bombs to number 58 Clybourne Avenue. But what you have not proven, even with the assistance of your bot, quote, squealer, Seliger, who would appear to have acted such a prominent part in the affair, is that any of those bombs were taken to the Haymarket. A couple of chemists also have been brought here as specialists, yet they could only state that the metal of which the Haymarket bomb was made bore a certain resemblance to those bombs of mine, and your Mr. Ingham has vainly endeavored to deny that the bombs were quite different. He had to admit that there was a difference of a full half an inch in their diameters, although he suppressed the fact that there was also a difference of a quarter of an inch in the thickness of the shell. This is the kind of evidence upon which you have convicted me. It is not murder, however, of which you have convicted me. The judge has stated that much only this morning in his resume of the case, and Grinnell has repeatedly asserted that we were being tried not for murder, but for anarchy. So the condemnation is that I'm an anarchist. What is anarchy? This is a subject which my comrades have explained with sufficient clearness, and it is unnecessary for me to go over it again. They have told you plainly enough what our aims are. The state's attorney, however, has not given you that information. He has merely criticized and condemned not the doctrines of anarchy, but our methods of giving them practical effect. And even here he has maintained a discreet silence as to the fact that those methods were forced upon us by the brutality of the police. Grinnell's own proffered remedy for our grievances is the ballot and combination of trades unions, and Ingham has even avowed the desirability of a 6-hour movement. But the fact is that at every attempt to wield the ballot, at every endeavor to combine the efforts of working men, you have displayed the brutal violence of the police club, and this is why I have recommended rude force to combat the ruder force of the police. You have charged me with despising, quote, law and order. What does your law and order amount to? Its representatives are the police, and they have thieves in their ranks. Here sits Captain Shack. He has himself admitted to me that my hat and books have been stolen from him in his office, stolen by policemen. These are your defenders of property rights. The detectives, again, who arrested me, forced their way into my room like housebreakers under false pretenses, giving the name of a carpenter Lorenz of Burlington Street. They have sworn that I was alone in my room, therein perjuring themselves. You have not subpoenaed this lady, Miss Klein, who was present, and could have sworn that the aforesaid detectives broke into my room under false pretenses, and that their testimonies are perjured. But let us go further. In Shack, we have a captain of the police, and he also has perjured himself. He has sworn that I admitted to him being present at the Monday night meeting, whereas I distinctly informed him that I was at a carpenter's meeting at Zepp's Hall. He has sworn again that I told him that I also learned to make bombs from Herr Most's book. That also is a perjury. Let us go still a step higher among these representatives of law and order. Grinnell and his associates have permitted perjury, and I say that they have done it knowingly. The proof has been adduced by my counsel, and with my own eyes I have seen Grinnell point out to Gilmer 8 days before he came upon the stand the persons of the men whom he was to swear against. While I, as I have stated above, believe in force for the sake of winning for myself and fellow workmen a livelihood such as men ought to have, Grinnell, on the other hand, through his police and other rogues, has suborned perjury in order to murder 7 men, of whom I am one. Grinnell had the pitiful courage here in the courtroom, where I could not defend myself, to call me a coward. The scoundrel. It's crazy. A fellow who has leagued himself with a parcel of base hireling knaves to bring me to the gallows. Why? for no earthly reason save a contemptible selfishness, a desire to rise in the world, to make money forsooth. This wretch, who by means of the perjuries of other wretches is going to murder 7 men, is the fellow who calls me coward, and yet you blame me for despising such defenders of the law, such unspeakable hypocrites. Anarchy means no domination or authority of one man over another, yet you call that disorder. A system which advocates no such order as shall require the services of rogues and thieves to defend it you call disorder. The judge himself was forced to admit that the state's attorney had not been able to connect me with the bomb-throwing. The latter knows how to get around it, however. He charges me with being a conspirator. How does he prove it? Simply by declaring the International Working People's Association to be a conspiracy. I was a member of that body, so he has the charge securely fastened on me. Excellent! Nothing is too difficult for the genius of a state's attorney. It is hardly incumbent upon me to review the relations which I occupy to my companions in misfortune. I can say truly and openly that I am not as intimate with my fellow prisoners as I am with Captain Shack. The universal misery, the ravages of the capitalistic hyena have brought us together in our agitation not as persons, but as workers in the same cause. Such is the conspiracy of which you have convicted me. I protest against the conviction, against the decision of the court. I do not recognize your law, jumbled together as it is by the nobodies of bygone centuries, and I do not recognize the decision of the court. My own counsel have conclusively proven from the decisions of equally high courts that a new trial must be granted us. The state's attorney quotes 3 times as many decisions from perhaps still higher courts to prove the opposite. And I am convinced that if, in another trial, these decisions should be supported by 21 volumes, they will adduce 100 in support of the contrary. If it is anarchists who are to be tried, and not even under such law, a law that a schoolboy must despise, not even by such methods have they been able to legally convict us. They have suborned perjury to boot. I tell you frankly and openly, I am for force. I have already told Captain Shack, quote, if they use cannons against us, we shall use dynamite against them. I repeat that I am the enemy of the, quote, order of today, and I repeat that with all my powers, so long as breath remains in me, I shall combat it. I declare again frankly and openly that I am in favor of using force. I have told Captain Shack, and I stand by it, quote, if you cannonade us, we shall dynamite you. You laugh. Perhaps you think, quote, you'll throw no more bombs. But let me assure you that I die happy on the gallows, so confident am I that the hundreds and thousands to whom I have spoken will remember my words, and when you shall have hanged us, then, mark my words, they will do the bomb-throwing. In this hope do I say to you, I despise you. I despise your order, your laws, your force-propped authority. Hang me for it. Woo! Book got intense. How you guys doing? Hanging in there? All right, let's continue on. Chapter 11. Somebody you guys might have heard of. Benjamin Tucker. State Socialism and Anarchism. How far they agree and wherein they differ. 1888. Intro by Malice. Individualist, anarchist, and publisher Benjamin R. Tucker was one of the most important radicals in American history. His long-running periodical, Liberty, was home to essays from anarchists and socialists of all stripes, at a time where socialism did not necessarily have the contemporary meaning of government control. In the same way that there are many answers as to what anarchism would look like in practice, socialism too had numerous variants. Here, Tucker tries to define and contrast the two concepts. All right, here we go. In the summer of 1886, shortly after the bomb throwing at Chicago, The author of this volume received an invitation from the editor of the North American Review to furnish him a paper on anarchism. In response, the above article was sent him. A few days later, the author received a letter announcing the acceptance of his paper, the editor volunteering the declaration that it was the ablest article he had received during his editorship of the review. The next number of the review bore the announcement. On the second page of its cover, that the article, giving its title and the name of the author, would appear at an early date. Month after month went by and the article did not appear. Repeated letters of inquiry failed to bring any explanation. Finally, after nearly a year had elapsed, the author wrote to the editor that he had prepared the article not to be pigeonholed, but to be printed, and that he wished the matter to be acted on immediately. In reply, he received his manuscript and a check for $75. Thereupon he made a few slight changes in the article and delivered it on several occasions as a lecture, after which it was printed in Liberty of March 10, 1888. Probably no agitation has ever attained the magnitude either in the number of its recruits or the area of its influence which has been attained by modern socialism, and at the same time been so little understood and so misunderstood, not only by the hostile and the indifferent, but by the friendly, and even by the great mass of its adherents themselves. This unfortunate and highly dangerous state of things is due partly to the fact that the human relationships which this movement, if anything so chaotic can be called a movement, aims to transform, involve no special class or classes, but literally all mankind, partly to the fact that these relationships are infinitely more varied and complex in their nature than those with which any special reform has ever been called upon to deal, and partly to the fact that the great molding forces of society, the channels of information and enlightenment, are well nigh exclusively under the control of those whose immediate pecuniary interests are antagonistic to the bottom claim of socialism, that labor should be put in possession of its own. I think people just used the word pecuniary a whole lot more in 1880s. What is this? That's hilarious. Excuse me. Pecuniary requires a lot of coffee. Almost the only persons who may be said to comprehend even approximately the significance, principles, and purposes of socialism are the chief leaders of the extreme wings of the socialistic forces, and perhaps a few of the money kings themselves. It is a subject of which it has lately become quite the fashion for preacher, professor, and penny-a-liner to treat, and for the most part woeful work they have made with it, exciting the derision and pity of those competent to judge. This is okay. Random aside, I was just reading a thread by a self-titled woman on Twitter who is proud to be called a thought. For those of you that don't know what a thought is, it stands for that hoe over there, and it's supposed to be sort of like a slutty woman type. And she was complaining that she was tired of people debating philosophy and libertarian principle with her when all she's trying to do is just be hot and make money being hot and talking about her opinions on liberty that are wrong a lot. And she was tired of all these libertarian nerds correcting her. Anyway, that's just kind of what this paragraph reminded me of. These people, what did he say? And for the most part, woeful work they have made with it, exciting the derision and pity of those competent to judge. Anyway, random. That those prominent in the intermediate socialistic divisions do not fully understand what they are about is evident from the positions they occupy. If they did, if they were consistent logical thinkers, if they were what the French call consequent men, their reasoning faculties would long since have driven them to one extreme or the other. For it is a curious fact that the two extremes of the vast army now under consideration, though united, as has been hinted above by the common claim that labor shall be put in possession of its own, are more diametrically opposed to each other in their fundamental principles of social action and their methods of reaching the ends aimed at than either is to their common enemy, the existing society. They are based on two principles, the history of whose conflict is almost equivalent to the history of the world since man came to it. And all intermediate parties, including that of the upholders of the existing society, are based upon a compromise between them. It is clear, then, that any intelligent, deep-rooted opposition to the prevailing order of things must come from one or the other of these extremes. For anything from any other source, far from being revolutionary in character, could be only in the nature of such superficial modification as would be utterly unable to concentrate upon itself the degree of attention and interest now bestowed upon modern socialism. Does anybody listening know what I just said? I mean, you read it 2 or 3 times and summarize it like sentence at a time, and you can get its meaning. Ah, man. Difficult to read. The two principles referred to are authority and liberty, and the names of the two schools of socialistic thought which fully and unreservedly represent one or the other of them are, respectively, state socialism and anarchism. Whoso knows what these two schools want and how they propose to get it understands the socialistic movement. For, just as it has been said that there is no halfway house between Rome and reason, so it may be said that there is no halfway house between state socialism and anarchism. There are, in fact, two currents steadily flowing from the center of the socialistic forces, which are concentrating them on the left and on the right, and, if socialism is to prevail, it is among the possibilities that, after this movement of separation has been completed and the existing order have been crushed out between the two camps, the ultimate and bitterer conflict will be still to come. In that case, all the 8-hour men, all the trades unionists, all the knights of labor, all the land nationalizationists, all the greenbackers, and, in short, all the members of the 1,001 different battalions belonging to the great army of labor, will have deserted their old posts, and, these being arrayed on the one side and the other, the great battle will begin. What a final victory for the state socialists will mean, and what a final victory for the anarchists will mean, it is the purpose of this paper to briefly state. I don't think I've read this before. This is interesting. Okay, continuing. To do this intelligently, however, I must first describe the ground common to both, the features that make socialists of each of them. The economic principles of modern socialism are a logical deduction from the principle laid down by Adam Smith in the early chapters of his Wealth of Nations, namely, that labor is the true measure of price. But Adam Smith, after stating this principle most clearly and concisely, immediately abandoned all further consideration of it to devote himself to showing what actually does measure price, and how, therefore, wealth is at present distributed. Since his day, nearly all the political economists have followed his example by confining their function to the description of society as it is, in its industrial and commercial phases. Socialism, on the contrary, extends its function to the description of society as it should be, and the discovery of the means of making it what it should be. Half a century or more after Smith enunciated the principle above stated, socialism picked it up where he had dropped it, and in following it to its logical conclusions, made it the basis of a new economic philosophy. This seems to have been done independently by 3 different men, of 3 different nationalities in 3 different languages: Josiah Warren, an American; Pierre J. Proudhon, a Frenchman; Karl Marx, a German Jew. That Warren and Proudhon arrived at their conclusions singly and unaided is certain, but whether Marx was not largely indebted to Proudhon for his economic ideas is questionable. However this may be, Marx's presentation of the ideas was in so many respects peculiarly his own that he is fairly entitled to the credit of originality. That the work of this interesting trio should have been done so nearly simultaneously would seem to indicate that socialism was in the air, and that the time was ripe and the conditions favorable for the appearance of this new school of thought. So far as priority of time is concerned, the credit seemed to belong to Warren, the American, a fact which should be noted by the stump orators who are so fond of declaiming against socialism as an imported article. Of the purest revolutionary blood, too, this Warren, for he descended from the Warren who fell at Bunker Hill. From Smith's principle, no relation, that labor is the true measure of price, or, as Warren phrased it, that cost is the proper limit of price, these three men made the following deductions. That the natural wage of labor is its product, that this wage or product is the only just source of income, leaving out, of course, gift, inheritance, etc. That all who derive income from any other source abstract it directly or indirectly from the natural and just wage of labor. That this abstracting process generally takes one of three forms: interest, rent, and profit. That these three constitute the trinity of usury, and are simply different methods of levying tribute for the use of capital, that capital being simply stored up labor, which has already received its pay in full. Its use ought to be gratuitous, on the principle that labor is the only basis of price, that the lender of capital is entitled to its return intact and nothing more, that the only reason why the banker, the stockholder, the landlord, the manufacturer, and the merchant are able to extract usury from labor lies in the fact that they are backed by legal privilege or monopoly, and that the only way to secure labor the enjoyment of its entire product or natural wage is to strike down monopoly. It must not be inferred that either Warren, Proudhon, or Marx used exactly this phraseology, or followed exactly this line of thought. But it indicates definitely enough the fundamental ground taken by all three, and their substantial thought up to the limit to which they went in common. And, lest I may be accused of stating the positions and arguments of these men incorrectly, it may be well to say in advance that I have viewed them broadly, and that, for the purpose of sharp, vivid, and emphatic comparison and contrast, I have taken considerable liberty with their thought by rearranging it in an order, and often in a phraseology of my own, but I am satisfied without in so doing misrepresenting them in any essence. Oh my god, dude. Just took like a paragraph to say I did my best to put it in my own words. Okay, moving on. First of all, what was it up here? Its use ought to be gratuitous, on the principle that labor is the only basis of price, that the lender of capital is entitled to its return intact and nothing more. Okay, so if one person used a really, really efficient in terms of the amount of effort it took to create and the resources it took to create the thing. If one person used a really efficient set of process that he had developed that didn't use many resources and was really easy on labor, didn't take much effort to produce this item, and another person had his own process to produce the exact same item. Let's hold that in common, right? Both people are producing the exact same item. But this other guy, his process is completely inefficient and wasteful and slow and dumb and, just completely inferior. So, maybe he does 10 jumping jacks in between each step just, because he thinks it's important to the product, and it, of course, isn't, but he does. And let's say he gets his materials from a really expensive source, or goes through a really expensive, time-consuming process to mine his resources to build his product. Like, it's just a completely terrible product. Well, the second guy, put 100 times the labor of the first guy into the item. And according to this theory, on the principle that labor is the only basis of price, that second item that's identical to the first, it would be 100 times the price, and rightly so, and people should pay that, or would want to pay that, because that item is inherently 100 times more valuable, because 100 times more labor went into it. Completely absurd. What's up, Outlaw? Story time with Patrick. Yeah, we're reading. I interviewed Mark Passio for Anarchapulco last year. Might have him on. Okay. It was at this point, the necessity of striking down monopoly, that came the parting of their ways. Here the road forked. They agreed on the stupid economic silliness, and from there they went in different directions with that bad information. Sorry. They found that they must turn either to the right or to the left, follow either path of authority or the path of liberty. Marx went one way, Warren and Proudhon went the other. Thus were born state socialism and anarchism. First, then, state socialism, which may be described as the doctrine that all the affairs of men should be managed by the government, regardless of individual choice. Marx, its founder, concluded that the only way to abolish the class monopolies was to centralize and consolidate all industrial and commercial interests, all productive and distributive agencies in one vast monopoly in the hands of the state. The government must become banker, manufacturer, farmer, carrier, and merchant, and in these capacities must suffer no competition. Land, tools, and all instruments of production must be wrested from individual hands and made the property of the collectivity. To the individual can belong only the products to be consumed, not the means of producing them. A man may own his clothes and his food, but not the sewing machine which makes his shirts or the spade which digs his potatoes. Product and capital are essentially different things. The former belongs to individuals, the latter to society. Spoiler, society is a concept and can't own anything. Society, it has to be people, that's my point. Not just some stupid nitpicky philosophy distinction. Yeah, it's a concept. Concepts don't own property. They can't participate in reciprocal property rights agreements. What that actually means, what this is obfuscating, though, is that when they say society, the capital belongs to society, what that's obfuscating is that society means a select group of people. So it's sort of like an oligarchy. Society must seize the capital which belongs to it, by the ballot if it can, by revolution if it must. Once in possession of it, it must administer it on the majority principle. Though its organ, the state, utilize it in production and distribution, fix all prices by the amount of labor involved, and employ the whole people in its workshops, farms, stores, etc. The nation must be transformed into a vast bureaucracy, and every individual into a state official. Everything must be done on the cost principle, the people having no motive to make a profit out of themselves. Individuals not being allowed to own capital, no one can employ another or even himself. Every man will be a wage receiver, and the state the only wage payer. He who will not work for the state must starve or, more likely, go to prison. All freedom of trade must disappear. Competition must be utterly wiped out. All industrial and commercial activity must be centered in one vast, enormous, all-inclusive monopoly. The remedy for monopolies is monopoly. Such is the economic program of state socialism as adopted from Karl Marx. The history of its growth and progress cannot be told here. In this country, the parties that uphold it are known as the Socialistic Labor Party, which pretends to follow Karl Marx, the Nationalists, who follow Karl Marx filtered through Edward Bellamy, and the Christian Socialists, who follow Karl Marx filtered through Jesus Christ. What other applications this principle of authority, once adopted in the economic sphere, will develop is very evident. It means the absolute control by the majority of all individual conduct. The right of such control is already admitted by the state socialists, though they maintain that, as a matter of fact, the individual would be allowed a much larger liberty than he now enjoys. But he would only be allowed it. He could not claim it as his own. There would be no foundation of society upon a guaranteed equality of the largest possible liberty. Such liberty as might exist would exist by sufferance and could be taken away at any moment. Constitutional guarantees would be of no avail. There would be but one article in the Constitution of a state socialistic country. The right of the majority is absolute. Yes, communism does equal slavery. So does socialism. The claim of the state socialists, however, that this right would not be exercised in matters pertaining to the individual in the more intimate and private relations of his life is not borne out by the history of governments. It has ever been the tendency of power to add to itself, to enlarge its sphere, to encroach beyond the limits set for it. And where the habit of resisting such encroachment is not fostered, and the individual is not taught to be jealous of his rights, individuality gradually disappears and the government or state becomes the all in all. Control naturally accompanies responsibility. Under the system of state socialism, therefore, which holds the community responsible for the health, wealth, and wisdom of the individual, it is evident that the community, through its majority expression, will insist more and more in prescribing the conditions of wealth, health, and wisdom, thus impairing and finally destroying individual independence, and with it all sense of individual responsibility. Whatever then the state socialists may claim or disclaim, their system, if adopted, is doomed to end in a state religion, to the expense of which all must contribute, and at the altar of which all must kneel. A state school of medicine, by whose practitioners the sick must Ho! When was this written? What am I about to say out loud? This was in 1888. Was published in 1888. Here it comes. Hold on. Sip of coffee. Oh boy. Let me read that again. Whatever, then, the state socialists may claim or disclaim, their system, if adopted, is doomed to end in a state religion, to the expense of which all must contribute, and at the altar of which all must kneel. A state school of medicine, by whose practitioners the sick must invariably be treated. A state system of hygiene, prescribing what all must and must not eat, drink, wear, and do. A state code of morals which will not... Oh, man. Let me read that again. This 2021. Let me read that one more time. A state school of medicine, by whose practitioners the sick must invariably be treated. A state system of hygiene, prescribing what all must and must not eat, drink, wear, and do. A state code of morals which will not content itself with punishing crime, but will prohibit what the majority decide to be vice. A state system of instruction which will do away with all private schools, academies, and colleges. A state nursery in which all children must be brought up in common at the public expense. And finally, a state family with an attempt at stripiculture. Stirpiculture? Stirpiculture. Looking this one up. Stirpiculture. If you guys know this word, if you're in chat and you know this word, I'm proud of you. The breeding of special stocks or strains, the breeding of special stocks or races. Stirpiculture. Wild. Okay. Where was I? Here we go. A state nursery in which all children must be brought up in common at the public expense. And finally, a state family with an attempt at stirpiculture, or scientific breeding, in which no man and woman will be allowed to have children if the state prohibits them, and no man and woman can refuse to have children if the state orders them. Thus will authority achieve its acme and monopoly be carried to its highest power. Such is the ideal of the logical state socialist, such the goal which lies at the end of the road that Karl Marx took. Let us now follow the fortunes of Warren and Proudhon, who took the other road, the road of liberty. This brings us to anarchism, which may be described as the doctrine that all the affairs of men should be managed by individuals or voluntary associations, and that the state should be abolished. When Warren and Proudhon, in prosecuting their search for justice to labor, came face to face with the obstacle of class monopolies, they saw that these monopolies rested upon authority, and concluded that the thing to be done was not to strengthen this authority and thus make monopoly universal, but to utterly uproot authority and give full sway to the opposite principle, liberty, by making competition, the antithesis of monopoly, universal. They saw in competition the great leveler of prices to the labor cost of production. In this they agreed with the political economists. The query then naturally presented itself, why all prices do not fall to labor cost? Where there is any room for incomes acquired otherwise than by labor. In a word, why the usurer, the receiver of interest, rent, and profit, exists. The answer was found in the present one-sidedness of competition. It was discovered that capital had so manipulated legislation that unlimited competition is allowed in supplying productive labor, thus keeping wages down to the starvation point, or as near it as practicable. That a great deal of competition is allowed in supplying distributive labor, or the labor of the mercantile classes, thus keeping not the prices of goods, but the merchants' actual profits on them down to a point somewhat approximating equitable wages for the merchant's work, but that almost no competition at all is allowed in supplying capital, upon the aid of which both productive and distributive labor are dependent for their power of achievement, thus keeping the rate of interest on money and of house rent and ground rent at as high a point as the necessities of the people will bear. On discovering this, Warren and Proudhon charged the political economists with being afraid of their own doctrine. The Manchester men were accused of being inconsistent. They believed in liberty to compete with the laborer in order to reduce his wages, but not in liberty to compete with the capitalist in order to reduce his usury. Laissez-faire was very good sauce for the goose, labor, but was very poor sauce for the gander, capital. But how to correct this inconsistency? How to serve this gander with this sauce? How to put capital at the service of businessmen and laborers at cost, or free of usury? That was the problem. Marx, as we have seen, solved it by declaring capital to be a different thing from product, and maintaining that it belonged to society and should be seized by society and employed for the benefit of all alike. Proudhon scoffed at this distinction between capital and product. He maintained that capital and product are not different kinds of wealth, but simply alternate conditions or functions of the same wealth. That all wealth undergoes an incessant transformation from capital into product and from product back into capital, the process repeating itself interminably. That capital and product are purely social terms. That what is product to one man immediately becomes capital to another, and vice versa. That if there were but one person in the world, all wealth would be to him at once capital and product. That the fruit of A's toil is his product, which, when sold to B, becomes B's capital, unless B is an unproductive consumer, in which case it is merely wasted wealth, outside the view of social economy. That a steam engine is just as much product as a coat, and that a coat is just as much capital as a steam engine. and that the same laws of equity govern the possession of the one that govern the possession of the other. For these and other reasons, Proudhon and Warren found themselves unable to sanction any such plan as the seizure of capital by society. But, though opposed to socializing the ownership of capital, they aimed nevertheless to socialize its effects by making its use beneficial to all, instead of a means of impoverishing the many to enrich the few. And when the light burst in upon them, they saw that this could be done by subjecting capital to the natural law of competition, thus bringing the price of its own use down to cost. That is, to nothing beyond the expenses incidental to handling and transferring it. So, they raised the banner of absolute free trade at home as well as with foreign countries, the logical carrying out of the Manchester Doctrine, laissez-faire the universal rule. Under this banner they began their fight upon monopolies, whether the all-inclusive monopoly of the state socialists or the various class monopolies that now prevail. Of the latter they distinguished four of principal importance: the money monopoly, the land monopoly, the tariff monopoly, and the patent monopoly. First, in the importance of its evil influence, they considered the money monopoly, which consists of the privilege given by the government to certain individuals, or to individuals holding certain kinds of property, of issuing the circulating medium, a privilege which is now enforced in this country by a national tax of 10%. Oh man. Let's all just take a minute to realize that none of us have ever lived in a world with only a 10% tax. And that men risked their lives and families and existences and lost those things in a fight against taxes much lower than what we suffer under today. Which is now enforced in this country by a national tax of 10%. Upon all other persons who attempt to furnish a circulating medium, and by state laws making it a criminal offense to issue notes as currency. It is claimed that the holders of this privilege control the rate of interest, the rate of rent of houses and buildings, and the prices of goods. The first directly, and the second and third indirectly. For, say Proudhon and Warren, if the business of banking were made free to all, more and more persons would enter into it until the competition should become sharp enough to reduce the price of lending money to the labor cost, which statistics show to be less than 0.75%. In that case, the thousands of people who are now deterred from going into business by the ruinously high rates which they must pay for capital with which to start and carry on business will find their difficulties removed. If they have property which they do not desire to convert into money by sale, a bank will take it as collateral for a loan of a certain proportion of its market value at less than 1% discount. If they have no property but are industrious, honest, and capable, they will generally be able to get their individual notes endorsed by a sufficient number of known and solvent parties, and on such business paper they will be able to get a loan at a bank on similarly favorable terms. Thus, interest will fall at a blow. The banks will really not be lending capital at all, but will be doing business on the capital of their customers. The business consisting in an exchange of the known and widely available credits of the banks for the unknown and unavailable, but equally good, credits of the customers, and a charge therefore of less than 1%. Not as interest for the use of capital, but as pay for the labor of running the banks. This facility of acquiring capital will give an unheard of impetus to business and consequently create an unprecedented demand for labor, a demand which will always be in excess of the supply, directly to the contrary of the present condition of the labor market. Then will be seen an exemplification of the words of Richard Cobden, that when two laborers are after one employer, wages fall, but when two employers are after one laborer, wages rise. Labor will then be in a position to dictate its wages, and will thus secure its natural wage, its entire product. Thus, the same blow that strikes interest down strikes interest down will send wages up. But this is not all. Down will go profits also. For merchants, instead of buying at high prices on credit, will borrow money of the banks at less than 1%, buy at low prices for cash, and correspondingly reduce the prices of their goods to their customers. And with the rest will go house rent. For no one who can borrow capital at 1%, with which to build a house of his own, will consent to pay rent to a landlord at a higher rate than that. Such is the vast claim made by Proudhon and Warren as to the results of the simple abolition of the money monopoly. There's several reasons why you would rent a house at a higher effective interest rate than what you'd pay if you bought it. Some people don't want to own a house. Some people are only going to be in the area a short while, maybe a year, and they don't want to get into like a long home ownership thing. I don't know. I'm not taking too much economic advice from people that are into the labor theory of value, but let's move on. Second in importance comes the land monopoly, the evil effects of which are seen principally in exclusive agricultural countries like Ireland. This monopoly consists in the enforcement by government of land titles which do not rest upon personal occupancy and cultivation. It was obvious to Warren and Proudhon that as soon as individualists should no longer be protected by their fellows in anything but personal occupancy and cultivation of land, ground rent would disappear, and so usury have one less leg to stand on. As soon as we redefine property to suit our personal feelings on the matter, everything makes more sense. Their followers of today are disposed to modify this claim to the extent of admitting that the very small fraction of ground rent which rests not on monopoly, but on superiority of soil or site, will continue to exist for a time and perhaps forever, though tending constantly to a minimum under conditions of freedom. But the inequality of soils, which gives rise to the economic rent of land, like the inequality of human skill, which gives rise to the economic rent of ability, is not a cause for serious alarm even to the most thorough opponent of usury, as its nature is not that of a germ from which other and graver inequalities may spring, but rather that of a decaying branch which may finally wither and fall. Third, the tariff monopoly, which consists in fostering production at high prices and under unfavorable conditions by visiting with the penalty of taxation those who patronize production at low prices and under favorable conditions. The evil to which this monopoly gives rise might more properly be called misusury than usury, because it compels labor to pay, not exactly for the use of capital, but rather for the misuse of capital. The abolition of this monopoly would result in a great reduction in the prices of all articles taxed, and this saving to laborers who consume these articles would be another step toward securing to the laborer his natural wage, his entire product. Again, this assumes that there is a natural wage and entire product. This is a fiction from beginning to end. Yeah, insert image of flying cars in Advanced City. Yeah, okay. Proudhon admitted, however, that to abolish this monopoly before abolishing the money monopoly would be a cruel and disastrous policy, first because the evil of scarcity of money, created by the money monopoly, would be intensified by the flow of money out of the country, which would be involved in an excess of imports over exports, and second, because that fraction of the laborers of the country which is now employed in the protected industries would be turned adrift to face starvation without the benefit of the insatiable demand for labor which a competitive money system would create. Free trade in money at home, making money and work abundant, was insisted upon by Proudhon as a prior condition of free trade in goods with foreign countries. Fourth, the patent monopoly, which consists in protecting inventors and authors against competition for a period long enough to enable them to extort from the people a reward enormously in excess of the labor measure of their services. In other words, in giving certain people a right of property for a term of years in laws and facts of nature, and the power to exact tribute from others for the use of this natural wealth, which should be open to all. The abolition of this monopoly would fill its beneficiaries with a wholesome fear of competition, which would cause them to be satisfied with pay for their services equal to that which other laborers get for theirs, and to secure it by placing their products and works on the market at the outset at prices so low that their lines of business would be no more tempting to competitors than any other lines. I'm sure these guys are not very good at economics. That is not how that would work. The development of the economic program, which consists in the destruction of these monopolies and the submission for them of the freest competition, led its authors to a perception of the fact that all their thought rested upon a very fundamental principle, the freedom of the individual, his right of sovereignty over himself, his products, and his affairs, and of rebellion against the dictation of external authority. Just as the idea of taking capital away from individuals and giving it to the government started Marx in a path which ends in making the government everything and the individual nothing, so the idea of taking capital away from government-protected monopolies and putting it within easy reach of all individuals started Warren and Proudhon in a path which ends in making the individual everything and the government nothing. If the individual has a right to govern himself, all external government is tyranny. Hence the necessity of abolishing the state. This was the logical conclusion to which Warren and Proudhon were forced, and it became the fundamental article of their political philosophy. It is the doctrine which Proudhon named Anarchism, a word derived from the Greek, and meaning not necessarily absence of order, as is generally supposed, but an absence of rule. The anarchists are simply unterrified. You mean to tell me people have been saying that since 1888, and we're still telling people that today? Man, we're up against some good indoctrination. The anarchists are simply unterrified Jeffersonian Democrats. They believe that the best government is that which governs least, and that that which governs least is no government at all. Even the simple police function of protecting person and property they deny to governments supported by compulsory taxation. Protection they look upon as a thing to be secured as long as it is necessary by voluntary association and cooperation for self-defense, or as a commodity to be purchased like any other commodity, of those who offer the best article at the lowest price. In their view, it is in itself an invasion of the individual to compel him to pay for or suffer a protection against invasion that he has not asked for and does not desire. And they further claim that protection will become a drug in the market, after poverty and consequently crime have disappeared through the realization of their economic program. Compulsory taxation is to them the life principle of all the monopolies, and passive but organized resistance to the tax collector they contemplate, when the proper time comes, as one of the most effective methods of accomplishing their purposes. Hint, hint. Shall I read that again? Compulsory taxation is to them the life principle of all the monopolies, and passive but organized resistance to the tax collector they contemplate, when the proper time comes, as one of the most effective methods of accomplishing their purposes. Their attitude on this is a key to their attitude on all other questions of a political or social nature. In religion, they are atheistic as far as their own opinions are concerned, for they look upon divine authority and the religious sanction of morality as the chief pretexts put forward by the privileged classes for the exercise of human authority. If God exists, said Proudhon, he is man's enemy. And in contrast to Voltaire's famous epigram, if God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him, the great Russian nihilist Mikhail Bakunin placed this antithetical proposition: if God existed, it would be necessary to abolish him. But although viewing the divine hierarchy as a contradiction of anarchy, they do not believe in it. The anarchists nonetheless firmly believe in the liberty to believe in it. Any denial of religious freedom they squarely oppose. At least they got one thing right. Well, I don't know. They've had a couple things right in here. Patent monopolies, competition with banks, for sure. Abolition of tariffs, awesome. You know, maybe the reason for doing those things, not really sound, but, you know, conclusions are cool. Upholding thus the right of every individual to be or select his own priest. They likewise uphold his right to be or select his own doctor. No monopoly in theology, no monopoly in medicine. Competition everywhere and always. Spiritual advice and medical advice alike to stand or fall on their own merits. And not only in medicine, but in hygiene, must this principle of liberty be followed. The individual may decide for himself not only what to do to get well, but what to do to keep well. No external power must dictate to him what he must and must not eat, drink, wear, or do. Nor does the anarchistic scheme furnish any code of morals to be imposed upon the individual. Mind your own business is its only moral law. Interference with another's business is a crime and the only crime, and as such may be properly resisted. In accordance with this view, the anarchists look upon attempts to arbitrarily suppress vice as in themselves crimes. They believe liberty and the resultant social well-being to be a sure cure for all the vices, but they recognize the right of the drunkard, the gambler, the rake, and the harlot to live their lives until they shall freely choose to abandon them. In the matter of the maintenance and rearing of children, the anarchists would neither institute the communistic nursery which the state socialists favor, nor keep the communistic school system which now prevails. The nurse and the teacher, like the doctor and the preacher, must be selected voluntarily, and their services must be paid for by those who patronize them. Parental rights must not be taken away, and parental responsibilities must not be foisted upon others. Even in so delicate a matter as that of the relations of the sexes, the anarchists do not shrink from the application of their principle. They acknowledge and defend the right of any man and woman, or any men and women, to love each other for as long or as short a time as they can, will, or may. To them, legal marriage and legal divorce are equal absurdities. They look forward to a time when every individual, whether man or woman, shall be self-supporting. Oh man, I'm reading this paragraph and like the absolute absurdities on TikTok are just flashing through my head. I'm like, oh man, what if TikTok existed back then and there was like LGBT barbecue wonderkin dragon kind gender? Would they have said that? Would they have said that here? They look forward to a time when every individual, whether man or woman or self, shall be self-supporting. I mean, yes, sure. Yeah, it's just funny. 2021 is funny. Shall be self-supporting, and when each shall have an independent home of his or her own, whether it be a separate house or rooms in a house with others, when the love relations between these independent individuals shall be as varied as are individual inclinations and attractions, and when the children born of these relations shall belong exclusively to the mothers until old enough to belong to themselves. Such are the main features of the anarchistic social ideal. There is wide difference of opinion among those who hold it as to the best method of attaining it. Time forbids the treatment of that phase of the subject here. I will simply call attention to the fact that it is an ideal utterly inconsistent with that of those communists who falsely call themselves anarchists, while at the same time advocating a regime of anarchism fully as despotic as that of the state socialists themselves. And it is an ideal that can be as little advanced by Prince Kropotkin as retarded by the brooms of those Mrs. Partingtons of the bench who sentenced them to prison, an ideal which the martyrs of Chicago did far more to help by their glorious death upon the gallows for the common cause of socialism than by their unfortunate advocacy during their lives in the name of anarchism, of force as a revolutionary agent and authority as a safeguard of the new social order. The anarchists believe in liberty both as an end and means, and are hostile to anything that antagonizes it. I should not undertake to summarize this altogether too summary exposition of socialism from the standpoint of anarchism, did I not find the task already accomplished for me by a brilliant French journalist and historian, Ernest Lysander, I don't know how to say French names, in the form of a series of crisp antitheses, by reading which to you as a conclusion of this lecture I hope to deepen the impressions which it has been my endeavor to make. Quote, there are two socialisms. One is communistic, the other solidaritarian. One is dictatorial, the other libertarian. One is metaphysical, the other positive. One is dogmatic, the other scientific. One is emotional, the other reflective. One is destructive, the other constructive. Both are in pursuit of the greatest possible welfare for all. One aims to establish happiness for all, the other to enable each to be happy in his own way. The first regards the state as a society sui generis of an especial essence, the product of a sort of divine right outside of and above all society, with special rights and able to exact special obediences. The second considers the state as an association like any other, generally managed worse than others. The first proclaims the sovereignty of the state. The second recognizes no sort of sovereign. One wishes all monopolies to be held by the state, the other wishes the abolition of all monopolies. One wishes the governed class to become the governing class, the other wishes the disappearance of classes. Both declare that the existing state of things cannot last. The first considers revolutions as the indispensable agent of evolutions. The second teaches that repression alone turns evolutions into revolution. The first has faith in a cataclysm. The second knows that social progress will result from the free play of individual efforts. Both understand that we are entering upon a new historic phase. One wishes that there should be none but proletaires. The other wishes that there should be no more proletaires. The first wishes to take everything away from everybody. The second wishes to leave each in possession of its own. The one wishes to expropriate everybody. The other wishes everybody to be a proprietor. The first says, do as the government wishes. The second says, do as you wish yourself. The former threatens with despotism. The latter promises liberty. The former makes the citizen the subject of the state. The latter makes the state the employee of the citizen. One proclaims that labor pains will be necessary to the birth of a new world. The other declares that real progress will not cause suffering to anyone. The first has confidence in social war. The other believes only in the works of peace. One aspires to command, to regulate, to legislate. The other wishes to attain the minimum of command, of regulation, of legislation. One would be followed by the most atrocious of reactions. The other opens unlimited horizons to progress. The first will fail, the other will succeed. Both desire equality. One by lowering heads that are too high, the other by raising heads that are too low. One sees equality under a common yoke, the other will secure equality in complete liberty. One is intolerant, the other tolerant. One frightens, the other reassures. The first wishes to instruct everybody, the second wishes to enable everybody to instruct himself. The first wishes to support everybody, the second wishes to enable everybody to support himself. One says, the land to the state, the mind to the state, the tool to the state, the product to the state. The other says, the land to the cultivator, the mind to the miner, the tool to the laborer, the product to the producer. As long as they actually stay there themselves personally and use it. Otherwise, when they leave, it's abandonment and it's no longer property. Sorry. There are only these two socialisms. One is the infancy of socialism. The other is its manhood. One is already the past. The other is the future. One will give place to the other. Today, each of us must choose for the one or the other of these two socialisms, or else confess that he is not a socialist. Well, I am not a socialist. Okay. Chapter 12. We will save for next time. Peter Kropotkin. Anarcho-communism. Boy, that's going to be a fun read. Oh, I've read this before, and it's not a fun read. All right, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this couple hours we've spent together. Made it through a good portion of the book. If you enjoy these, please let me know in the comments. I'll keep doing it. Otherwise, I will just continue reading on my own and not stream. But yeah, I'm having a good time. So until next time, everybody, have a good evening.